This section of the meeting is really for our work group to kind of think about what have we heard so far. And I wonder if you would mind if David Dunn joins us. David is kind of my alternate. David, would you mind coming up? So David, when I agreed to do this, it was if Dave Dunn could be here as an alternate. He's the HRA director for Olmsted, and since we're few in number, maybe having Dave contribute to our thinking of how to move forward would be very helpful. So, what are your takeaways from the meeting that we've had so far with trying to do this joint work together? We ended with the question of with trying to begin to process a little bit. I don't know how you are, but I had tons of notes once again with overwhelming number of ideas. So the question is, how do our two work groups organize our next steps on the important topics identified? We had a list, I believe, that was distributed with sample recommendations. We previously had recommendations distributed earlier on tenant voucher recommendations and on landlord incentives and best practices as a place for us to begin. It came out in our packet. Leo's looking at me like, what are you talking about?
In the materials that were sent ahead of time, there was a document from the what was the document called, Jessica, with from your group, the AI? Yeah, that's what she's referring to.
Yeah, so that's the recommendations that the state put out for their analysis of impediments, which, by the way, is still in a comment period or just finished their comment period. So, Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, but they are not the final recommendations. As a matter of fact, some advocates are pushing for stronger recommendations, so there may be changes. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so we have that as background, and then we just got a draft example of recommendations for our housing and stability opportunity work group, and Kathy's going to walk us through that.
Yeah, so maybe I think, with the limited time we have as a work group, I think one of the things that would be most helpful to me and to Jessica and to Merritt and other staff is to start to put something in front of you based on the conversations that you've had so far. And so what I passed out is the document that says draft example, and if I could put draft on this about 18 more times, I would. It is for discussion only. It is intended really as a guiding document for our discussion today so that you can help me understand even more the altitude, the boldness, the specificity, some of what you will be looking for as working group members from staff so that we know really the best way to bring you information out of these meetings that's starting to take some shape and form of recommendations for your consideration to bring to the task force. So what Merritt put these up on the slides, which I think is really helpful. So you can see it up there if you're watching from afar. But if those of you prefer to look at the piece of paper that's in front of you, they're the very same words. But if it's okay with our co-chairs, I think if we could just walk through these a little bit and have discussion about how these sound to you, I think that'll be maybe the best use of our 35 minutes that we have here.
So at this point, we're not worried about having a comprehensive set of recommendations. We're focusing on some preliminary recommendations, see if as stated, they're complete, and then also having a discussion about how specific we want to be, how broad, how specific, and whether we want to be strong or soft in our set of recommendations, just get a flavor of the group.
Yeah,
that's clear?
That's clear, yeah. Okay. Very much want to stress this is a sample. It is not, I'm not even trying to be all inclusive of everything we've heard so far at all, just a sample. Okay. So for the first slide you see there, a very bold recommendation that the Housing Stability Work Group could make would be something like, we recommend the legislature increase support for both housing infrastructure bonds, which is the capital, and housing trust fund rental assistance to meet current and projected housing demand for all households at or below whatever the area median income is that you would like to target. So that would be, it's pretty broad, not a lot of specificity other than your recommendation that we invest in those two funding mechanisms, one being rental assistance, one being capital. On the other hand, at our very first meeting, for example, or I guess it was our second meeting, but it was our substantive conversation around barriers to housing, we did hear a recommendation from one of the panelists that that the Bridges program here at Minnesota Housing, which is a rental assistance program that works with people with mental illness, works very well, but it's oversubscribed. We don't have enough of that to go around. So one recommendation that's more specific could be, we recommend the legislature increase funding for the Bridges program at Minnesota Housing to meet the needs of more low-income Minnesotans with mental illnesses. So those being two very different kinds of examples of recommendations you could receive, I just wanted to get thoughts, input, guidance.
Remind me again, I'm sorry, the focus of the Bridges program?
Rental assistance for people with mental illness. Serious and persistent mental illness.
So I want to, I'll get to you the second thing, Leo, but one of the things that strikes me, and actually something I've been asked to call out to this group, is that there are actually three proposals currently before the legislature, I believe, Alice. One is the housing infrastructure bonds. And I think I don't know if there's a proposal out of capital bonding for the housing trust fund. I think that would probably be general fund. But there's also, you have a proposal, Alice, for what, 110 million? 140 million? And so one of the things that's been confusing is that I believe Senator Senjum and I'm not sure who the House author is, has a bill for $50 million for supportive housing. And that supportive housing proposal is to help the people in transitions from, particularly the mental health area. It's kind of a two-prong. One is the bonding for the urgent care centers for mental health, and the other one is the supportive housing for stability for the long term. And so I guess when I first read this, Kathy, I was asked to alert Alice to the difference between those two, and not that they're in competition, but that there's two proposals out there. And I would hope that you know, we should at least add that as yet another proposal that's out there right now, as an example of a broad strategy, whereas your Bridges is a very specific strategy.
And here is my frustration about that. We've heard that bill already. So the reason they define that program is there are people who are mentally ill, they're ready to be discharged from the hospital, and rather than send them to Anoka or the Hennepin County Jail, they want an emergency short-term
That's the one bill, yep.
so that they don't have to be discharged to the street. Here's the dilemma. Unless we're doing a lot more housing infrastructure bonds, when they get to the end of their short term, there still won't be a place for them. And so here's what I fear that we're doing in housing. Problem, program, funding stream. Problem, program, funding stream. And soon you've got an inefficient and ineffective delivery system at the, all because we don't have enough of anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I'm going to support that bill. I just hope they don't take it from the amount we're asking for housing infrastructure bonds, because it just confounds the problem. So I have a lot of frustration right now.
I'm sure you do. Did you want to comment about that?
Just one comment on that, specifically with the bond request for the, I think now we're calling them triage centers or crisis centers. I don't know, they've changed the terminology.
Mental health crisis.
Mental health crisis center, and then the supportive.
Mental health urgent care center.
Yes, urgent care. Thank you. The one comment I'd make too on that is that the complementary piece would be the permanent supportive housing that they're looking at. I totally agree with you that we need to make sure that they're both urgently needed, with the idea being hopefully that the two with the urgent care and then the permanent supportive housing can really build together. And one of the things I talked about is, while it says permanent, I think we should really work with people to try to build them to where we no longer need it. And so the idea would be to build that pathway for us, so we're not putting people into the ER when they do get released from places like Anoka or St. Peter, so we can kind of build that. But there's certainly a need for both. And I know that we've been working in Olmsted County on both real closely, and I'm hopeful that we can have some success.
So can I pose the question, and then I'll come to you and see the question for us really right now is not, is this inclusive enough, but do we want to have a bold approach or do we want to have a specific approach with this kind of recommendation? Lael.
Thank you. I wanted to address that question. But first, I just wanted to say, Representative Hausman, that sounds like a recommendation that you're putting on the table too, that maybe we should be considering, is this sort of, combining of funding streams in order to look at things holistically. So I'd just say that we should probably put that in our bucket of recommendations, is that the funding stream may be a barrier to actually service through housing. But to the question at hand, I think that there is a need for both and. I want to draw your attention again to what I had handed out earlier, that analysis of impediments recommendations. And one of the things that they did is they had kind of 7 overarching goals. So they had these ideas that we say we see in the housing world, or in this case, in the fair housing world, that these 7 goals need to be met. And one of them was, reduce displacement. One of them is, address fair housing rights. And then underneath those, we got more specific with actors identified. So I would suggest to the panel that that may be something that we do. So the first one, the bold and broad, seems like we keep hearing over and over and over again the need for money, right? The need for a serious commitment to housing as infrastructure, as housing as a right, and the need to fund that. So that maybe could be one of our overarching goals that we hear. I mean, the second one that I feel very passionately about is this: we need to address the tenant screening criteria that is, a barrier to people accessing housing. So if we have these broader goals, then we can underneath address the more specific ones, because, the more specific we get, the less likely we're going to reach consensus on them. But I think that being specific means that we can take action. So.
Just a thought, and again, I'm not an expert on any of these things, but to me, the bold, broad statement about housing infrastructure bonds, trust fund, the idea of the mental health urgent care centers, I mean, that's about production. And so I just want to kind of pull us back to our focus is on access to service, access to housing, maintenance of housing. If I would suggest, if we want to send a note of encouragement to the rental folks, I mean, I think our production and the funding stream for production ought to come through the rental group. What I do think is potentially in our bailiwick, perhaps, is this notion of services and housing combined in that model. So I don't know anything about the urgent care, the mental health urgent care centers, if that's a new model, and what seems relevant to us is somehow the integration of services and housing, and maybe that's something that we can get behind in terms of what's in our bailiwick. I don't want us to spend a ton of time drilling down in the housing trust fund, because that really is production and supply oriented. Very important. So that's just one thought.
So with your suggestion, then, Paul, would the tenant, sort of tenant rights, I was making notes of Lael, got tenant rights as something we'd like to see. That would include screening and evictions and notice and all of those things that might fit more in the rental group than ours for the specifics?
No, I do think tenant screening is a huge access issue. So I do feel like that falls to us. I really liked a lot of what I heard today around the Bill of Rights and Tenant Bill of Rights, and how that might be able to cover, not, check off many of the issues that we're concerned. Obviously, the specifics of it matter a lot, but I think that does fall under our purview.
Kathy wants to jump in here.
Just a quick suggestion, and I thought the same thing after our meeting just now with the rental group, when that became a little bit more clear around the production piece. The housing infrastructure bond part of the recommendation, I think, would make sense to then kind of hand over to the rental group. The question I'm having is around the rental assistance, however, in terms of the housing trust fund rental assistance really being a key to accessing housing in the market.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that, one of the ideas around affordable housing trust funds these days, I mean, particularly, well, I sit at a panel that is approaching the city of Minneapolis about establishing an affordable housing trust fund, is the flexibility behind it. So not just addressing production, not just addressing preservation, but also addressing things like rental subsidies. So while I do understand that we want to keep production and even preservation really to rental, I think having things like a flexible affordable housing trust fund that is robust, that can be used where needed, such as bridges or emergency assistance sort of things, that may still be in our realm.
I would agree.
Okay, so let's go on to the next one as an example. So
the next example, this is sort of, for lack of better words, the softer, stronger question. A couple of examples of softer recommendations that have sort of bubbled up from some of our conversations are, we recommend cities reduce the use of unnecessarily restrictive tenant screening and zoning practices to increase housing access for those with criminal histories, prior evictions, and other barriers. So the soft word being, we recommend to the cities. The next one, we recommend state and local government agencies provide education to cities, counties, and relevant public safety entities on the impacts of local ordinances and residency restrictions on those with criminal history or other barriers. Stronger, and so Merritt, if you could flip the slide, would be a couple of, and these are not necessarily replacing exactly each other, but just examples of stronger language. We recommend that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights pursue actions to limit restrictive zoning, non-safety-based occupancy limits, and other unnecessarily restrictive tenant screening practices. Another one could be, we recommend a public-private partnership be established to fund a statewide initiative that uses an incentive-based approach to partnering with property owners and managers to increase willingness to rent to people who have criminal histories or other barriers. Those could be a variety of things, including master leasing, risk pools, et cetera.
So thoughts? Go ahead.
I like the stronger here in this case. I think the other two feel way too soft to me and feel like they would just kind of just float in the air. I like the specificity of both of those. One would be something around this tenant bill of rights. I like the last one around the public-private partnership. I'm struck at how, and have heard from our folks within my organization, how important it is to have whatever's going to come out of this has to be crafted in partnership with landlords, and particularly private landlords. I mean, we at PPL, and I even think the PHAs, I mean, we have to deal and engage in this, and there's a lot of hard work there, but the private landlords, I think, are just crucial to this. And so I like the specificity of the public-private partnership below there. I really like the master leasing concepts and would like to get more specific. It feels like that's a best practice or an emerging practice that has a lot of potential.
Others? Are you looking to us, Kathy, to talk about, you're not talking about like the subject of this, but more the language?
Yeah,
right?
it's more your desire of the kind of recommendations that will come back to you. And I think it is really important for people here and also watching from afar to know that these truly are samples and drafts to get to this conversation, as opposed to the exact language of our, nobody's seen these. Right. You've not seen these until today.
Then I would second Paul's position, which is I really like the stronger language. I think that's going to be more effective for us to take actual steps afterwards than the softer.
Alice, what do you think?
And so I think none of these are mutually exclusive. So I would say I want our statements to be bold, broad, specific, and strong. In other words,
You want it all.
I mean, anything but soft. Because these are already going to be very hard. I was just looking at the one that asking the Department of Human Rights. They were just in my office asking for language to be in the bonding bill about equity. And they tried to get it in last year. And of course, what they don't know, people like you aren't around there anymore in the majority, is anything with equity the language isn't going to make it into any bill. Yeah. That's the sadness. It's why I'm having such a hard time throwing myself into this discussion today, because I know something about the reality of anything that requires action up
So
there.
I am totally sympathetic to your frustration, having lived it and still living it to a certain extent. On the other hand, I think the balance that we have to strike is, are we really advocates? This task force has an advocacy role to help move thinking, but on the other hand, some language might shut minds down. So we're going to have to be a little bit careful. I think Dave was next.
Yeah, the comment I'd have kind of on the format, I think, is kind of what Representative Hausman talked about. It's a little bit of both. I think that having some overarching goals and some bold vision statements with some more specific actions that could be taken is probably the right combination. So I think your answer is all of the above, not either or. And then be specific enough that they can be actionable items, you know, both at the state and then federal, state, and local level, you know, and maybe that's part of what we want to look at, or how are some of the things that can be done in different areas. I think a lot in my day job is the local level, working with an HRA, and what can we do and where do we have influence, and especially where it comes to reducing barriers. And I hope to be piloting some programs locally in the next 6 months or so that we could start to really have an impact. And I think some of the recommendations that we could come up with would have a positive impact in our ability to put some of that together that maybe can become pilots for across the state.
Well, that's actually what I was going to say, is that I think if we are looking at these, at this task force recommendation document only as speaking to what the state legislature is going to get through, I think we're looking at it too narrowly. You know, I think that, like Sheila was saying, that we need to recommend what we think needs to happen. We need to recommend what we think is going to address the crisis. And if that doesn't go through the state legislature, you know, then it doesn't. But we could bring it to a city. We could bring it to a PHA. We could bring it to, you know, a county and say, look what the state, the task force recommended. And this task force is recommending that we put money into X. You, Hennepin County, would you be willing to do it since let's just say the state isn't? So I think we do need to put in what is required and what we believe is going to address the crisis, and then look at the various bodies that could use it as a tool.
I think there are going to be a lot of cases where we may not be able to spell things out in great specificity, but it can be a guidepost or a signpost. And I guess that's some of what I was thinking, that there are going to be some of these issues where all we can do is talk about it broadly, and yet others where we may be able to drill quite far down. So I think it's probably going to be like the representative had said, we'll have it covering all four, which doesn't make it easy for staff, but maybe the reality.
Yeah, I wanted to mention last week at our staff meeting, we had a discussion about recommendations. And one of the ideas that came forward is you could have, you know, higher level statements and then a number of different examples of strategies that might implement it. And that might be a nice way to balance the more general with then options. Maybe some would fly at the legislature, some wouldn't, they'd be local. So you can kind of do a bit of both.
Anyone else on the topic? Okay, Kathy, you want to move to the next one?
Sure. So let's go on to the next one. And these are just additional sample language to look at. And I just wanted your take on it. I knew that we were talking about this issue today. So these were, you know, based on what we'd originally discussed a little bit, but hadn't yet had this conversation today with our panel. But a couple of examples are, we recommend Housing Choice Voucher administrators identify and implement strategies, thank you, to increase the number of property owners and managers willing to participate in the Housing Choice Voucher program. We recommend the legislature support automatic expungement of housing court appearances when a tenant wins their case in court. That is a recommendation that came out of one of our meetings earlier around barriers. We recommend that state and local governments prohibit any properties with government funding from refusing to lease to a tenant based on the status of the tenant as a voucher holder or recipient of similar rental assistance. So these are using kind of a combination of the strong, soft language, mostly related to court appearances and vouchers. So just any additional thoughts there I thought would be helpful if any of these hit a note for you.
Bill?
Yeah. So the first one, so one of my questions is, On the first one of the recommending housing choice voucher administrators identify and implement strategies to increase the number of property owners that use vouchers. One of the issues is that PHAs have been doing that. You know, they've been doing that for a really long time. So recommending that isn't going to address the need of landlords accepting vouchers. So on that particular one, I feel like we also have to reflect back on what has already been done and why that isn't working, right? So that's already been done and that's still not working. So either we have to think of something that's bolder, or we have to make specific strategies that maybe PHAs haven't done before. But I just know that that's not a recommendation for any new action, for what that's worth.
Lael, that's also bringing up another really good point. It was really interesting to think about who are we recommending these recommendations to? Who are we suggesting take these things? And for every single one of these, that could be a question. Maybe there's a couple of different entities that they're targeted to. But I think to all of your point, you know, maybe there's a bolder strategy with several action items, and they could be identifying different people or entities to implement them.
To me, this one fit, I'm sorry, Alice, I spoke over you, but to me, this one fit under the other recommendation about having a public-private partnership to establish statewide initiatives. This seemed like that might be a place to look more deeply at what are the real barriers that it isn't happening. But Alice, I spoke over you.
I don't want to lose what both Eric and Laura made a recommendation, and Laura's recommendation had to do with timing of when that eviction appears on your record. By the time she got to court, it was already there, and so I don't know if that could be
Another good example.
right.
Yeah.
That would, I mean, that seemed to me such a concrete one. And then what I've forgotten is what Eric said, 43 other states already do that we don't. I can't remember.
Pay or quit eviction.
Oh.
Eviction processes. So it sounds like ours, I'll get into that topic. I don't know a lot about eviction, so I'm tempted to delve too deeply right now. So, okay, so Dave knows that I ask a lot of questions.
I've never known you to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions.
Staff person for your board.
Okay, moving right along. We got some feedback on any of the others that are up there as sample recommendations from this group.
I had one other, I'm sorry. So the last one.
Don't be sorry, this is part of our process.
Right, right, and there are only like 3 of us, so you know, who else is going to talk? So the recommendation that state and local governments prohibit any properties with government funding from I think that state already does that. And so let's be specific on that. I think there are several, maybe it's just local governments, because I think that all of the state programs that already, that give funding already require that, so.
I would think there potentially TIF would be what you'd be talking about from a local municipality.
Say that again?
So I think right there where you could be looking at would be TIF.
TIF?
TIF, tax extension. Yeah. So if you were to receive for redevelopment TIF, for example, you may not be required to.
I see.
So that's where there might still be a need for that. That's where those could be lost in this shuffle.
Got it. Yeah, you're right.
All right. Kathy, what else?
Well, so this is very helpful, and that was exactly what I intended, was just to really start to get you thinking about what you are looking for based on these conversations. I think what would be helpful now, Sheila, is to maybe just circle back to see if anybody has any comments based on today's conversation with the rental group, ideas of where you see this is definitely something that our working group should dive a lot deeper into, should get more information on, should do some more research, versus what you think the rental group will do. That would also help us prepare for our next.
Alice.
I have a different question, and since we're getting close to the end, this week there was a surprise announcement. The commissioner's not here, so I was going to pose it to her, that she's part of a group that is meeting, and they have a plan already for ending homelessness, and they announced it. And I will tell you, I was so but I mean,
Not to you, Kathy.
if that's the case, if the commissioner already has a plan, do you understand my confusion about that press release? Because I thought, well, then why are we continuing to meet here?
So I think I can answer that. So the plan that was just released called Heading Home Together is a plan to prevent and end homelessness specifically. I think our work on this task force is absolutely a part of that. Those recommendations in that plan are not only about housing, but include a lot of recommendations about other levels of service, et cetera, as well. But the work we're doing here, I think, is broader than just homelessness. And so I think one of the interesting, what you're bringing up, though, that I wanted to ask all of you, is that we do have that Heading Home Together plan. Some of those recommendations are specifically around housing. And actually, one of them is to work with the governor's task force on housing to identify the gaps in affordable and supportive housing and then help to fill those gaps. So I think there's a placeholder in there for the work of this group. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is that there are other recommendations in there around naturally occurring affordable housing, restrictive tenant screening. They're relatively broad with a few specific state agency actions, but they do not say what others should do. They do not talk about what city and local governments should do. They do not direct other entities other than state agencies. And so I think we could all look at those and see where you think this body could elevate some of those strategies and recommendations that you think are appropriate for this working group. In addition to that, I think what you brought today, Lael, and also what Jessica sent out ahead of time, there are recommendations in there this group should look at and think about ways to elevate. And also the Olmsted Implementation Office has the Olmsted Plan that has some very specific housing recommendations. So there are these big reports and enormous amounts of work that have been done that I think this body has the ability to lift up and support in ways that none of those could do on their own.
Yeah, I haven't read the report yet, clearly, but I think about the population that doesn't necessarily fall into the homelessness numbers and are addressed by services that, like, even the people who came and spoke who are living in naturally occurring affordable housing and moving from place to place to place. So they're not homeless, but they're paying 50% of their income, then 60% of their income, then 70% of their income in order to stay out of the homeless population. And that isn't necessarily something that this report is going to address, the homelessness, even though they are at risk for homelessness. So I'm hoping that this is broader than the homeless, just the homelessness report, which I can't wait to read, Kathy.
Strongly recommend it.
But I wanted to talk about, you asked about what should we lift up, and these are, I heard over and over again, issues with evictions, issues with expungement, and tenant screening. We heard several recommendations, several legal recommendations regarding potential ordinances, potential statutes. Yes?
Will you list those?
Repeat them again. So we had tenant screening, which includes credit reporting and eviction reporting. And we had evictions themselves, so the reporting of evictions, the process of filing evictions and how they were being used as a collection tool out in Greater Minnesota. And then finally, expungements. So how do people get this off their record, how they keep it off their record. And there was one thing that I wanted to add that I didn't bring up because we were so short on time before, but we've been looking at things outside of the state for other potential solutions. And I know in California, I believe it was in California, they recently passed, I don't know if it's citywide or statewide, I can see if I can find it, but evictions are actually sealed until there is a determination. So that kind of goes along the way that Laura suggested, Laura Jelinek, although hers would probably be easier because it would be through a court process rather than going to the state. But there is this, it is not reported, is a sealed file until there is a judgment of some sort, which is when one would argue landlords would want to know about it, rather than at the filing point before a decision or an adjudication is made.
Diane.
Rick Goodman had mentioned that in Indiana, they've got a housing bill of rights, and I think that resonated with some people, so that might be one to explore. And then the very first speaker, was it Tanya? Tanya. She had talked about some kind of a guideline or a book that, and I would have thought we would have had something like that in Minnesota, but it may just not be very widely.
Have that book.
It may not be widely distributed.
Just wanted to make.
Yeah.
Attorney General.
Right, the Attorney General. I've got a box in my office.
Yeah, but again, it may be
Yeah.
that we know about it.
Yeah, we need to make
People who
more
very-
people aware of
who
it.
very well need it, don't know about it.
I was actually looking to see if I had a copy in my briefcase. One comment that I would just kind of want to make on this too, as far as next steps and conversations. I think that having more conversations with the landlords in the property management community, there was some good start of that today, but really I think on that private side, and I know that Sheila talked about it too, so many of the people that provide affordable housing are private landlords, as the HRA or PHAs. We provide such a, in the overall market, we're just a drop in the bucket. As much as we'd like to do, we can, but there's limited funding. And so for me, having more of those conversations, maybe a little less structured, but a little more, what do you see as those barriers that you're seeing every day? What would make you more willing to overcome some of those barriers, and what kind of assurances from that perspective are you looking for? So if we make recommendations on program creation, they're programs that would be well received in the property management community. As someone who's made the mistake before of creating a program and not asking the question and then having it fail, I think making sure that on the front end, whatever we do is something that they'd look at with a positive response would be very helpful.
To kind of reiterate what I said at the end of our previous meeting, I think if we're really looking at person-centered planning for people with any kind of disability or long-term care needs or whatever, and then looking at how you provide those supportive services within a privately owned residences. And part of that is then landlord interface. They talked about navigators. That's really kind of part of that. We haven't spent much time on that. It's sort of a loose concept of a housing navigator. I think you've done more on the homeless side than on the long-term housing side to help people navigate into housing and keep their housing for maintenance. We haven't delved at all into some of the things that were raised today about how you protect landlords with risk management so that they are willing to take the hard to place or the person with the bad history. And we maybe need to spend a little more time understanding that concept, or what might be recommended for next steps to explore something like that for Minnesota, this concept of a renter insurance pool or a risk mitigation for landlords. We didn't seem to have much time on that. Okay. Sheila? Mm-hmm.
It seems to me something went wrong today about the planning of the agenda for that second panel. If I were that second panel, those members, I would be leaving totally frustrated, because I think they had been given a set of questions and they had come with a fair amount of, but then we had not nearly enough time for them. And so I don't know, something in the communication of that second panel, it seems to me went wrong. And a lot of what we're saying we need more of, I think they had actually come prepared to do. So I'm not certain if that is something we need to keep in mind for future.
Okay.
One of the other things that I'm remembering is there was a mention, I think the phrase was transaction displacement, and people who have been working on some kind of a policy that St. Louis Park has.
Yes.
So that, I don't know if that had been touched on before, but that seemed like that was another critical issue for the NOAA housing
Displacement policy that
situation.
St. Louis
Yeah.
Park has developed with private landowners.
Can I speak to that? Because I actually sat on the,
Can we hold, because we're supposed to be out of here now.
okay, but I do have two more.
Really, really fast.
I don't have to speak about it right now, but I sat at that table that decided that. And one of the things about that, though, that's not a solution for displacement. What that is a Band-Aid after displacement happens. I mean, what it really is
It doesn't prevent,
it does not
it manages
at all.
once it's going to happen.
That's right.
Okay.
So, yeah,
So
displacement.
Diane is saying that you can't hear maybe is that we need to look at that whole question of displacements within the housing stability work group.
But there are two other things. The first is, and I may be in the minority at this table, I know we have to engage the landlords, and I think that that public-private partnership is inherent to work to get done. However, we also heard a lot about the imbalance of power. And the reality is we're going to have to take some steps to make that power balance that landlords may not like, because we have to understand that they're business people, right? And they want to run a business, which is great. They want to make a profit, which is great, but we cannot maximize profits on the back of people in their homes. So we may have to make decisions such as, or make recommendations, at least from my perspective, such as just cause, extension of just cause protections for people, or that 90-day notice ahead of selling that landlords may not like, but it rebalances or attempts to rebalance the power. So I just want to put that out there.
So I'm just gonna, I think you and I don't disagree with what you've had to say, but I don't think we're gonna find solutions without having landlords fully at the table and finding the ways to work together well. And right now we seem to, because people have had a lot of bad experiences and there is a power differential, we have an assumption that there is no, we're working on a set of assumptions we need to question a little bit. So
I don't know what you're talking about, a set of assumptions.
I will gladly take this offline with you because we
Okay.
have like 3 minutes to be out of here.
Well, the only other
So-
thing that I had was 30%. 30%, we talked about 30% and drilling down deeply to see what type of specific subsidies could cover that 30% income, because we heard a lot that we need to somehow get money, and I don't know the answers to that, but.
Well, and we heard a number of things about housing choice vouchers, and I think, maybe recommending that we look more deeply. We're certainly experiencing it. I'm looking at Dave a little more deeply at housing choice vouchers as what are the options there in terms of the federal rules, what's happening in our state, and is that something that we would want to advocate that there be state contributions to as well as federal funds? I mean, there's ways to look at that. So here we are.
Would you like me to talk about our next meeting?
Yes.
Okay, our next meeting is scheduled for April 12th at 9 a.m. here, again, 9 to noon. I wanted to run by you an idea for the focus of the topic of the next meeting. In addition to continuing, they're kind of all build on each other, as you can tell. We're kind of repeat back and focus back on some of the things we've talked about so far. It seems to me it may be time to move in the conversation around integration of housing with services, integration of housing with health and services, something along those lines to start to get some of that information out on the table for us. And learning from having large panels, and while they are enormously powerful and helpful, I think these conversations have been really rich. I think because we do need to start diving into actual recommendations and development of recommendations, I think what I'm learning from these conversations is that we will maybe have one or two people join us to talk about the integration of health and services, but not very large panels, if that sounds right to you. So I'm basically running that by you to see if that seems appropriate at this stage, and if health and integration of health and housing and services is where you'd like to go next.
So, Mayor, could you put up the next slide, please? Just to remind us where we are. We really only have April and May to kind of get to by May, we have to start formulating our recommendations, and by June, we have to finish them. So we're going to kind of we're moving now into our round 2 topics for our April meeting, which is being suggested that we look at the integration of housing with services as the round 2 set of topics. Is that feeling right for people?
Alternatively, the other is we could focus more deeply on evictions and displacement impacts, which is also on our list for the maintaining, to build on today's conversation, if you'd rather go there. Yeah.
So I would suggest after the meeting that you have a conversation with her, because what we're talking about, they've done. and we talked about it just briefly in the break, but we should know more about that.
Okay. Okay, great.
So it sounds like we have no alternatives to suggest at this moment. We know we're meeting on April 12th. The co-chairs will probably meet with staff, have a conference call in between to look at, we debrief, and then we have a conversation about next agenda. So if you have some suggestions for us, we are open to that, and we'll do our level best, really with leaning heavily on Kathy and Merritt to plan the next agenda. And are any of you planning to come to Austin? I know the representative won't any of you coming to Austin. A few staff will be there. There are 100 people right now, roughly, who have signed up for that forum. And the challenge for that will be as well as how to keep that focused The idea, I think, right now is a panel and then small group discussions. So we'll report back next time as well as what the experience of that has been.
And I look forward to seeing some of you at dinner tonight at Wilder with St. Paul Promise Neighborhood Parents. So,
And who will be there for that? Who should we, okay, a few of us there? All right, great.
okay, good. You got to eat.
Do come. All right, so I'm going to declare us adjourned and thank everyone for their time and attention and energy that we're putting into this, and we'll turn the mics over to our colleagues.